Hi again. Manfred Brauch, The Hard Sayings of Paul, a book I definitely would urge upon people who have issues with sometimes the language, but more often the interpretation of the New Testament. Chapter 1 of the book is God wrathful? This is the text Brauch chooses. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth. God's wrath is difficult both to understand and to believe. For some, the idea of a wrathful God has been a roadblock to faith. For others who have experienced the transforming grace and love of God in their lives, the idea of God's wrath has seemed to contradict their experience of God. Can we believe that the God whose unconditional love is revealed in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, that's Romans 5:8, is at the same time a God of wrath? Before we tackle the main issues here, we need to discuss the biblical use of anthropomorphisms, the use of analogies from human experience to describe God. The Bible speaks about God's nature, work, and purposes in terms analogous to what we know and experience as human beings. This is by necessity. God's absolute nature is not open to finite creatures. We can only approximate what God is like by comparing him to us. Indeed, the incarnation, God's coming into our midst in the Word, become flesh, gives legitimacy and authority to anthropomorphic speech about God. In traditional theological language, this necessary and legitimate use of anthropomorphisms has been recognized, but it also has its limitations. Thus, while knowledge and power are aspects of human experience, God is said to possess these in an absolute, infinite sense. He is omniscient, that is all-knowing, and omnipotent, all-powerful. Generally, those aspects of human nature and experience which we have identified as the highest and the best have been ascribed to God. We see God as the one who is or possesses truth, grace, beauty, love, righteousness, faithfulness in their most complete or absolute forms. But a corollary of this way of speaking about God is the resistance to ascribe to God human attributes or feelings which we perceive as negative: hate, anger, a vindictive spirit, ugliness, and so forth. Wrath is clearly one of these. There is some biblical warrant for this resistance. For example, in Hosea chapter 11, the reason for God's refusal to give up on Israel, though she clearly deserved destruction on the basis of human standards of justice, is the fact that I am God and not man, Hosea 11 verse 9. However, the major reason for our difficulty in accepting such negative human attributes for God is an idealistic, romantic notion of God, born from philosophical speculation. The Bible does not have such a notion of God, for it takes both God and the world more seriously than abstract philosophical speculation. The Lord of the Bible enters into relationship with his creation in Jesus of Nazareth, in whom all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. That's Colossians 1:19. It is this Jesus who is, at the same time, in all respects like us, according to Hebrews 2:17. The Bible also takes the relationship between Creator and creation with utmost seriousness. Because the creation is God's, it is responsible to God. Within such a relationship of accountability, romantic, idealistic, sentimental concepts of God are out of place. Against this larger background, the concept of God's wrath must be understood. It is instructive that Paul speaks of the revelation of God's wrath within the context of a theology of creation. The biblical story of creation and alienation, contained in the opening chapters of Genesis, clearly forms the backdrop of Romans 1:18 to 23. Especially verses 21 and 22 are a poignant reminder of the refusal of humankind, that is Adam, to live as creature in relationship with God, and instead to grasp for likeness with God. In the Genesis narrative, the temptation is to deny our creatureliness, our limitations, our dependence on the Creator in order to become like God, Genesis 3:5. The result of that denial is that we become debased, less than authentically human. According to the narrative of Genesis 3 to 11, the denial of dependence on and accountability to God results in a wide variety of distortions within various spheres of human community. Paul, in Romans 1:25, sums up this situation with these words: "They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator." It is within this assessment of God's purposes for creation and its refusal to be accountable within those purposes that the idea of God's wrath needs to be heard. Paul speaks of the wrath of God in two ways. Mostly, the expression refers to a future event in which God's judgment is executed on the world's sinfulness. In these contexts, God's wrath, or its synonym, God's judgment, is clearly perceived as an activity of God, his decided action against sin. It is important to note here that wrath is God's personal response to sin, though unlike that of the various divinities of Greco-Roman religions and myths, God's wrath is never capricious, vindictive, or malicious. In our text, Paul does not say that God's wrath will be revealed at the last day, that is, Judgment Day, but rather God's wrath is being revealed from heaven now. It is not only the divine response to the creation's unfaithfulness in the future judgment, it is already a present reality. This sense of a present manifestation of God's wrath is confirmed in several other passages from Paul, as well as in other New Testament writings, specifically John 3:36. As the passage which follows 1:18 shows, the present manifestation of God's wrath is indirect rather than direct. It is an expression of God's permissive will, not God's active will. God is not depicted here as doing something in response to human sin. In some sense, God's wrath is built into the very structure of created reality. In rejecting God's structure and establishing our own, in violating God's intention for the creation and substituting our own intentions, we cause our own disintegration. The human condition, which Paul describes in Romans 1:18-32, is not something caused by God. The phrase revealed from heaven, where heaven is a typical Jewish substitute for God, does not depict some kind of divine intervention, but rather the inevitability of human debasement which results when God's will, built into the created order, is violated. Since the created order has its origin in God, Paul can say that the wrath of God is now, that is, constantly being revealed from heaven. It is revealed in the fact that the rejection of God's truth, that is, the truth about God's nature and will, leads to futile thinking, idolatry, perversion of God-intended sexuality, and relational moral brokenness. Those are all included in the verses from 18-32. The expression God gave them over, or handed them over, which appears 3 times in our passage, supports the idea that the sinful perversion of human existence, though resulting from human decisions, is to be understood ultimately as God's punishment, which we, in freedom, bring upon ourselves. In light of these reflections on our text, the common notion that God punishes or blesses in direct proportion to our sinful or good deeds cannot be maintained. God's relationship with us is not on a reciprocal basis. God's radical, unconditional love has been demonstrated in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. God loves us with an everlasting love, but the rejection of that love separates us from its life-giving power. The result is disintegration and death. Against such a perverted creation, God's wrath is revealed. I'll put in a link to the first of 3 videos we did when Paul was in Athens preaching before the Areopagus. What was his bottom line? It was the day of judgment indeed. But among the things he said characterized at least Greco-Roman life in those days was a groping. The comparison he uses is the blind man groping along the wall trying to find the light. So that's, of course, God's visitation of wrath upon men who turn their eyes away from God, according to Romans 1. Next time, one man's sin means my death? ? That's chapter 2 of Manfred Brauch, Hard Sayings of Paul.